Is it up? Okay. Well, I want to thank you all very, very much. You've made it to the end, those of you who stuck by this, and I promise I'll be short. I'm actually a very, very simple creature, and I hope to present an argument that's excruciatingly simple, and perhaps you'll be able to unmask it and help complicate it for me in a way that will serve as a pre-digestive before your lunch. And the title of the talk, as you see now, is Collisions. I'm interested in collisions of societal constitutions, hierarchies of power and their arrangements, horizontal effects, and management in the context of the human rights regime, which kind of underlies a lot of what we've been talking about. So I'm trying to put a lot of little pieces together and then put them in motion and see what happens. And really, if you want to reduce what I'm going to say, and now you can fall asleep for the next 10 or 15 minutes, if you want to reduce what I'm going to say to you, it's motion. That's all I'm interested in, is motion. And I start, of course, the consequences of these emerging frameworks we've been talking about for 2 days, these hierarchical power arrangements, the horizontal effects, among are creatures, not just states, although we keep going back to states, I don't know why, states and other societally constituted organisms, which are the things that interest me more. And I'm going to present a series of questions in the framework. I still have no idea what the answer is, and I'm hoping you all are much smarter than I am. You'll be able to provide it for me. And in fact, I've got the same conundrum that Americans have when they walk in here. This is a Yasukuni shrine in Japan. It's my counter image to Gunther's Odysseus. They're all dead. Some of them are in hell, or what passes for it in accordance with whatever cosmological system you believe in. Some of them are in other places. And the site itself becomes problematic and infested with multiple meanings and effects. It's static and yet not quite. And so the order of the study is fairly straightforward, and the paper is fairly long, so I'm going to go through this fairly quickly, and you can read most of this. The first section is really framework setting, the theory of constitutionalism, which has now been done to death. But my problem with it here is this constitutionalism as a spatially static and inward-looking perspective. I find them both irritating. The investigation of this thing is divided into two parts. The first, I worry about the parameters of the ordering system for states and non-state actors, what makes them institutionally interesting or viable, why do we bother? And the second is a brief consideration of this systemicity, these postulates for the constitution of corporate actors. I could have chosen others, but corporate actors within the framework, and of course the object is the multinational corporation as the exemplar of these self-constituted enterprises. Will it work or not? The image there, these are kind of inside jokes for me. They're probably less amusing for you. This is a battle emplacement. The Spanish are very funny people. I love them to death. I owe my genetic pool to them for the most part. But they have a habit of building things that are obsolete even at the time they did it. This is one of the guns that they put on top of the castle in Montjuic in Barcelona, which at the time that they had paid for it was already incapable of piercing the armor of the ships that were supposed to come and invade the country, and that's sort of where we're going here. This third section then, for me, is the most interesting one, which considers these constituted societies, and these constituted societies, by the way, which are themselves framed by human rights regimes. We've talked about them already, these autonomous human rights regimes that sit both within and outside these constituted corporations, this permeability of what appears to be outwardly strong and yet inwardly like the Yasukuni shrine full of paper that can be easily pierced. The third one, the third section means to put these things in motion. I want to look at this in a more dynamic and outward-looking perspective, and it requires an examination of the way in which societally constituted entities can be felt and seen. This is a point I raised earlier. There's institutions in the abstract are fairly meaningless. They acquire meaning when one can, in one way or another, feel them or see them, when one can experience them in some way. And so that's what I want to do. I want to see how they're like as experienced entities when these things are put in motion. And the way in which expressive communication, structural coupling, if you like, can have inward as well as outward effects. And then, having done all of that stuff, I try to see if it has any kind of relation to anything that we wind up doing. And so section 4 actually for me was the most interesting section. I try to apply all of this stuff as badly thought through as it is to a particular case. And in this case, it's the case of Apple and their friends at Foxconn and their friends at the Fair Labor Association, where you've got collisions in vertically and horizontally impermeable spaces, which affect each other, which may or may not affect the internal constitution of these things and their autonomy, but which may have both inward and outward effects. And it's that effectiveness of these things, the communication, which go back to ultimately helping us understand the nature of the integrity of these institutions and the way they function. That is, not an inanimate Frankenstein, but hope I couldn't get the image, but Frankenstein after we pop the electrical, the lightning bolt to him and see how that works. So, three things: the examination of spatially complex universes, self-constituted governance, the organization of power externally, and then whether this has anything to do with anything that we look at. So let's constitute the governance universe. I love this picture. It's the Spanish Parliament, which on the one hand looks very, very formidable, and yet obscured in a lot of ways from the outside, and when you go inside, as ephemeral as its outward constitution appears to be fairly formidable. Societal constitutionalism may somewhat look like the same thing. So we've got constituting actors. Constitutionalism, of course, as we've seen for the last few days, highly contested subject as an idea, as an ideology, in its connection to law and norm. I'm not going to go through any of that stuff. We've had 2 days of it. As inherent in the organization of states, or as available to other actors, whatever these actors are, however you can consider them constituted. But I want to look at constitutionalism instead as a framework for organizing power. And for me, that brings up two fundamental issues in constitution, in constituting. The first is reification. That is the seeing and the feeling, in terms both internal and external. And the second is values. Having constructed this thing, how is it going to live? How is it? Is it going to have 3 legs? Is it going to have 4 legs? Have blue eyes, or is it going to have curly hair? So reification and values are at the heart of this thing, seeing, feeling, and then responding to the environment. And the problem of reification, of course, is one about understanding, both self-understanding and the understanding externally. The society has to be constituted both to understand itself and so that it could be understood by others in a way that it understands itself. More, it's this problem of the accounting standards is a very, very nice example of the problem, both of the nature of the issue of understanding oneself through these rules and of communicating that understanding to others and forcing them, in a sense, to accept that constitution externally as well as internally, this imposing of structures, language, constructing, incorporating, in this case, corporations internally and externally. So there's a self-consciousness here and an external recognition. And of course, the problem, do outsiders see and feel the same thing as insiders? Do they accept it? How does one acquire legitimacy in the context of this thing and its borderlands? The problem, beyond the problem of reification, is the problem, of course, of values and recognition. You can see something and recognize that you don't necessarily have to accept it, and if you don't accept it, you can either suppress it or ignore it. But self-constituted entities don't like being either suppressed or ignored if they're strong enough. And so you've got what I call the legitimacy issue, process legitimacy, the rule of law. In a lot of contexts talked about in the context of the rule of law, and substantive values legitimacy, which comports with baseline values of the group. The normative values, of course, and its recognitions have been highly controversial. We all in this room, for the most part, have been quite loyal to the normative basis of communal values derived from an international order grounded in or expressed through public international bodies. But there are others. Religion is one, and a fairly strong one. There are others as well, and there are other competing governance frameworks. But whatever it is, you have to have it. So when you put all of this together, just very simply, you've got reification, you've got normative values and a self-constitution, but a kind of imperialist self-constitution. Ultimately, beyond organizational legitimacy, going to the way I conceive of the subset of the way I conceive of sovereignty, which revolves around the issue of consent and constitution, not democracy and constitution, but consent and constitution. Beyond sovereignty, of course, is a structuring ideology that gives consent its force, and I go through a number of its features that makes it its own internally compact world order. So legitimacy, ideology, construction, and animation are the groundings for constitutional order. Without any of these things, we talk about a creature that is incomplete. And in this case, once it is put together, fairly well established, and one that sometimes defies descriptions, and yet we know it when we see it. I put up the easy case, and it's a public law case, Libya versus France. Libya under Gaddafi versus France. Was Libya a legitimate state? Not the territory that we now call Libya, but was Libya a legitimate state is France. If Libya is not a legitimate state, can France send its soldiers in without violating the rules of horizontal comity? Can the people of Libya move in and overthrow their government as opposed to France? Although we'll see what happens in France in the coming years. But that remains to be seen. So when we look at constitutions, then we see the ordering framework, and for my purposes, putting all of this together, you can understand constitutionalism, including but not limited to societal constitutionalism, really is a system of classification, the core object of which is to define characteristics of constitutions, that is, the documents or other things that organizes power within an institutional apparatus, which is used to determine the legitimacy of the system as conceived and implemented based on a rule of law as a foundational postulate, and that's inherent in the aggregate nature of the organism. That is, that government is established and operate in a way that limits the ability of an individual to use that power for personal welfare. You no longer have a self-constituted entity, you have a leveraged individual, right? And it's grounded on a metric of substantive values derived from a source beyond the control of any individual. You put it all together, and you have what for me may be societal constitutionalism. Can it be applied to corporations? For this group, of course, the answer is simple. We kind of assume it. And the answer may be yes. Organization, legitimacy, sovereignty, and ideology are four pillars of this constitutional edifice that I'm sort of creating. Is the state a fifth pillar? Until maybe 15 years ago, the answer would have been, my God, absolutely. The thing is grounded on the state and indeed proceeds from the state out. We've now turned this around and suggested that these things then proceed to and maybe through the state. State ideology would presume that it's required because of the usual explanations. But globalization, of course, is decentered. We've had all of these discussions I just pointed out. And that creates a space where one can extract an organizational element within this constitutional worldview, which I reduce just for the sake of simplicity to four. Organizational character, four principal organizational characteristics: the scope of authority, institutional autonomy, regulatory authority, what we talk about as secondary normative construction, and then the effectiveness of power to settle disputes. If societal constitutionalism, of course, can be understood as this articulation of a general framework of governance that's not dependent on the state, can we understand corporations as capable of this thing? I go through this in the paper. The answer I suggest is yes, and not just corporations. Of course, we've talked about systems themselves as potentially covered by this, but certainly I think corporations may for these reasons also. But I'm going to run out of time, so I'm just going to go through it. The corporate form is actually a nice one because in a lot of ways it does mimic the state without a territory. It's framed by its form rather than territory. It's functionally differentiated within its own operating system. It's grounded in an ability to move across territories in an integrated and compact way. And it can enable rules derived from the powers and functions of its charters. It can not only create a constitution, but create subsidiary normative rules, laws and law system, and develop mechanisms for correcting disputes. These can be internally applied, right? Corporations develop a contract-based system of governance. It can be, and that contract-based system would incorporate the norms, and those norms themselves can be externally generated. Jane has, of course, talked about one product certification. We tend to look at normative systems that have been ground through the sieve of public international organizations, the OECD guidelines, the UN guiding principles of human rights, in the context of the construction of normative systems, which are then existing outside of the corporation, but then incorporated within it voluntarily. Or you can develop your own. Walmart was famous for doing that, and of course, as we're going to see, Apple was as well. I spent a little bit of time talking about these systems. I'm not going to do that today. The PowerPoints, by the way, because it's just too long. The PowerPoints are available online if you want to see them. These, of course, are governance principles which themselves can be viewed as constituted within a societally constituted framework for normative construction, which then communicate with the corporations that may or may not bargain with them, that may or may not adopt some or all of them. The general principles, of course, are the latest and endorsed last year, and there have been very, very strong movements on the part of the UN to move it along. All right, so we have all of this complexity, most of which is, at this point, just horribly reviewed. Oh, this is one of the floats in the alternative Mardi Gras parade. There's the normal Mardi Gras parade made up of societal elements, and then there's the Crew de Veau, which is the alternative parade made up just by people who constitute themselves independent of the organized system for the creation of parades and create their own, both in mimicry of, but quite substantially different from those that will include the Mardi Gras King. And so I put this in here to see if we can get this parade going. So the dynamic element suggests if we create these constitutional systems that I've shorthanded over the last 10 minutes, if we create these constitutional systems, we understand that constitutions have a certain way of creating institutional integrity. We see their component parts. We understand their complexity. We understand how they are meant to create these organisms that are meant to be seen and felt. Otherwise, there's just no point, internally and externally. Who cares? I mean, it's very nice. It's like seeing 5 minutes. I'm almost there. All right, it's like seeing those lovely statues on the bridges between this part of Turin and the other. What happens when you actually put this in motion? Constitutionalism just has been freezing this dynamic process, and I want to see what happens when the issues of collision and communication occur. That is movement, and the movement, I think. The movement, I think, is best understood, and I use, I abuse Hans's work and I abuse Günther's work here to try to put this together. For me, Hans's notion about the topology of legal orders and their territoriality maps out a three-dimensional space in which these institutional organisms exist, but three-dimensional space of odd and multiple territorial definitions, which is not only three-dimensional, but which is itself inherently permeable, and yet permeable without affecting the integrity, the ultimate integrity of the institutions that are being created. The permeability permits the communication. But the question then is, if in fact we've created these structures like this room, and we've posited permeability, and we've posited multiple interpretations of territory, have we not in effect now undone what we've done, destroyed the fundamental legitimizing institutional character of institutions we've created by the very definition of the institution in its relationship with others? So does permeability dissolve the integrity of the self-constituting organism? The answer may well be, and this is where Günther comes in, perhaps only in the face of catastrophe. Because we move from the construction of a space in which all of these little fish, all of these little things exist and are driven, to a system in which by moving against each other and by moving internally within the logic of their own organization, as Günther much better than I can explain, we trigger a metastasized pattern of behavior that is ultimately destructive. And in that context, the enterprise is either destroyed, because catastrophe can reduce the system to incoherence, or can create a set of functions through which the organizations themselves, working through permeability in three-dimensional space, can reorder themselves and reorganize themselves, preserving their own autonomy through the loss of autonomy in communications. And we've got motions, collisions, and we go from chaos, perhaps, to order. Here I'm putting words in Günther's mouth, because the key to this positive collision may be pattern systems of relations that I think of as a management function that's inherent in the operation of this complex web, in which these systems and subsystems, of course, as Günther says, irritates each other before the reality of catastrophe. I'm going to listen to you more as I face the reality of a change, unless, of course, I'm Greece, or in the case of Apple, unless it really hits me in the face. And so I wanted to see if all of this works. So putting all of this together, and I'm trying to go very fast, and I'm probably even more incoherent than normal. Systems, big, stable, pretty, becomes much less solid, and yet retain their solidity by the very act of surrendering the solid space, by their ability to move within and between each other in three-dimensional space, preventing their dissolution by an aggregation that permits the preservation of integrity even as it sacrifices it. That sounds even worse than what I tried before, but there you have it. So here we go. I'll spend 2 minutes on Apple. Putting all of this together, does this work? Is what I've said now just stringing words together? English is my second language, so I can string words together. It makes perfect sense to me, but it may not make sense to anyone else. So let's see if all of this works when we look at Apple as a permeable and a solid business. These are people, by the way, who are lining up to work at the Shenzhen plant for Apple. Let's look at the reality of the socially constituted Apple in a world of socially constituted framing systems, governments, governmental forms, consumers, investors, and the like, and their ability to face catastrophe and change it. I start by looking at Apple as an autonomous government. That's fairly easy to work through. If you apply the principles of societal constitutionalism, I think Apple is an easy case. Not only does it constitute itself, right, but it constitutes its own universe of dependence including its supply chain, relationships. The Constitution not only sets up Apple as an autonomous institutional actor, but sets up a normative framework for the conduct of Apple, of its relationship with others, in a closed and self-referencing system that is grounded in contract. It's imposed, having created this normative system, it's imposed through its value chain, through its supplier code of conduct, through transparency and communication with NGOs and the press. But it remains self-contained, and Apple was for a long time notoriously insistent on maintaining its own universe of normative values, which it derived itself as it chose from a variety of different sources, but to none of which was it dependent for certification and the like. Apple's boundaries were set by its supplier relationship. It was accountable only to its consumers and investors, and monitored to some extent by outside shareholders and the like. They resisted communication with other organizations, and it made it very, very hard for them to work. But they were still irritating. There's push and push back. And sometimes it worked well with some of the NGOs, and sometimes it's Mike Daisy and This American Life, which was an embarrassing situation where he had these pictures of all of these poor Chinese people who were dying in slave camps and throwing themselves off buildings, and he was sort of kind of right, except he was absolutely wrong, which was a big coup. The TV show had to cancel his appearance. And there's this communication which is not pleasant and indeed quite violent between the two. Apple is resisting, but catastrophe comes. And catastrophe comes in the form of Foxconn. Foxconn, of course, is itself, people view Foxconn and they think of a poor hut in Bolivia where you've got a bunch of people who look like that picture, who are making all of these things, and it's a poor operation. But Foxconn is actually the trade name of Hong Hai Industries. Later becomes a subsidiary of Hong Hai Industries that is owned by a guy named Terry Gu, who has himself set up a huge multinational in its own right, with 13 factories in China and factories in Brazil, Hungary, Slovakia, the Czech Republic, India, Malaysia, and Mexico. Huge operation. Its own system of CSR standards, which it communicates, but in a relationship of dependency with Apple, for whom it manufactures things. All kinds of problems. First, people suicide themselves because they lose prototypes, and then 14 people jump off the buildings to protest labor conditions. Foxconn's reaction was instructive for an institution. They solved the problem of the suicides and the underlying labor issues by installing suicide netting on the bottom floors of all of their buildings, so that if you jumped, you would just do a trapeze instead of a squash. And with that, they thought that they had solved the, I don't invent this stuff. With that, they thought they solved the problem. I'm almost done. So, they're almost done. So they're working through this. You've got irritants, you've got change, you've got catastrophe. The 14 people finally, right, the constant insistence of holding Apple to its own normative standards that defined itself as an integrated, autonomous entity, finally forced Apple to face a disaster. Either they were going to be exposed as a rapacious consumer of people for the production of goods for upper middle class people in Europe and North America, or they would have to find a way of changing, and they wound up doing something extraordinary. And that was, they conceded the limitations of their own autonomy for the production of normative standards and announced their membership in the Fair Labor Association, which is an NGO created originally by clothing manufacturers to monitor sweatshop conditions. Right, and they incorporate, their normative standards incorporate national and international norms into a hybrid governance framework of the kind that's very similar to Jane's certification program. People have been very critical of the Fair Labor Association. In any case, their president earns almost $260,000 a year, and these fees are paid for by Apple and the other companies who are purchasing the certification. Right? And so there are a lot of NGOs. There's an inter-NGO war, so conflict, collision, three-dimensional space. Fair Labor Act, I'm done, I'm out of time. Fair Labor Act, colliding with them in the face of catastrophe, Apple moves. And so what you have, I think, is a nice example of both the solidity of modern societal constitutionalism, its obsession, necessary obsession, both with reification and with the construction of normative values, and its permeability, its intangibility, its ability to work through within a constantly moving three-dimensional space, which I think makes societal constitutionalism, I'm done. Much more interesting. Sorry.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry to ruin the guillotine. So, presentation. Take some questions. We have time for questions, so you don't have to disappear. Save the questions. Dave.
Last night at dinner we were invited to explain what it was we meant by societal constitutionalism, a bit of a challenge rather than an invitation. I'm not going to take up the challenge, I'm just going to edge around it. And I may have misunderstood what it is that is static, but I understand it to be the societal constitution that is static. And I was struck by that because I see nothing static there, I see nothing but dynamism and I guess when I think about the societal constitution, I think about, for example, structural couplings that don't create stability but that unleash resources that put processes in motion. I see intersections between different normative orders not as leading to stability, but as being channels for collisions that are never resolved, tensions that are put on the table rather than pushed to the back burner. I don't see the process of communication between systems as a question of management leading to stability and order, but as a question of, again, bringing to the surface the tensions, the incompatibilities, the impossibilities of communication between these systems. In other words, I see nothing but dynamism in these structures.
No, and then that's an excellent point. And in fact, I went back and forth on this. And it really depends on your perspective. From my perspective, when I looked at the issue of societal constitutionalism, the question for me was, well, what is inherently necessary in order to understand it and the nature of the debate, and then what may be consequential and something that may be interesting flow from it, with which it is pregnant, et cetera, but not necessarily central to the notion of societal constitutionalism. And when I looked at this, I took exactly what you said, but wait a minute, if I talk about this that way, that I've got a thing that may be inherently, or there may be consequences, or things may happen. What I've done is taken both the three-dimensionality, the permeability, and the consequential movements, and made it a consequence or a second-order consideration in societal constitutionalism, privileging the actual construction of the constituting edifice, and sacrificing as a non-necessary part the motion, which includes the possibility of dissolution and change. And I said, well, maybe it would be neat. I don't know if it's going to work. I'm still working through it. Maybe it would be neat, rather than look at it as edifice building, to look at it as motion building, that it is something that you don't end by saying, aha, you put wheat and eggs and in a bowl, you put it in the oven, and presto bango, you've got a self-constituting organ. And now you worry about, are you going to eat it? Are you going to feed it to your cat? Are you going to step on it? And I thought that it might be, the theory itself might be much more fun to play with and much more useful if you moved that consequential stuff into, no, that is a first order issue with respect to the construction of societally constituted organisms. And if you do that, you change the reference just a little bit, the results might be a little different. But I don't know if it will be.
Is the mic around? Oh, sorry. Question from Romulus.
You won't mind if I put this polemically?
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, you start with dynamism and mobility and motion and freedom and permeability. And they're very nice words, but they also mount onto what Marx called the promiscuity of capital, yeah? Capital doesn't like long-lasting relationships. It likes lots of partners, yeah? So you move around the promiscuity of capital. And I wonder whether, you start with the reaction to the state, and you end up with a functionally differentiated demos that look like Walmart, yeah? The demos of investors and consumers. And there's a massive loss of the political in this, unless we treat the political as a completely free-floating signifier. So that would be, I'm sorry, it's not...
No.
There's an objection.
No, that's perfect. That's perfect, and that's perfectly right. But also, maybe not necessarily wrong either, or maybe necessarily wrong as well. It's true. You wind up at the limiting, but there's no such thing as a limiting case. I don't posit that the state disappears, but except in the Apple case, in fact, the one actor I didn't mention, because they were completely absent, was the United States as the home country, completely out of the picture. Taiwan as the home country of the supply chain owner, completely missing, and China as the host country, completely missing. And so all of this is decided, right? The bodies of the workers falling out of buildings in China, decided by the nature of media reproduction of this in the West, and the anticipation of catastrophe caused by the demos-like action of a group of people who are completely disassociated from their relationship with the state, and whose relationship with Apple and Walmart is promiscuously temporal, right? And yeah, and to some extent that is the world. Now, but from my perspective, well, is politics absent from this world? On the one hand, traditional politics is absent because the state is absent. On the other hand, there's an old notion in corporate law that suggests that when you abolish the directors and you take on directorial powers, then the obligations of the directors, both their powers and their obligations, will flow to the person who actually uses it. So in another sense, you can say, well, in fact, political power has both morphed and moved to people who ought to make us somewhat more uncomfortable, a kind of movable demos of investors and consumers, right? Which is horribly, horribly unsettling, especially since we spent the last 200 years trying to solidify demo by constructing borders, to the extent that even in the world of globalization, we are very, very careful about limiting the ability of labor markets to go global. And so, yeah, the answer is yes. The political is gone as we have come to understand it. To the extent it gives us comfort, that was very nice. The new politics is more permeable, much more transitory, much more asymmetric, and will follow money in a very time-sensitive way. It's not a pretty picture, if you like the state.
Okay, I think, unless final question.
Can I do a question?
Maybe very short question.
We're hungry.
Very short question. I have a couple of announcements to make as well.
Thank you for your presentation. Very, very nice. And I want just a brief question about political system in US. Okay, because I was reading a journal, New York Times, and I was amused about the fact that the competitor of Obama, that should be Romney, right, talked about on the journal that what you have now in the USA, the system, okay, working system promoted by Obama, it's wrong. Because they said, why do you want more holiday pay? Why you want rights? You don't have enough. So, which is the line between the rights in the United States? Because I see that Romney has a 50% of the nation following, and Obama is a little bit less. But Obama promotes rights, probably the fair rights. Instead of what I've read about your journal, it's what he said.
Oh, about Romney promoting wrongs?
Yeah, because that's what they said. That on the journal that was written that what the rights of the laborers that were promoting were wrong. The system was wrong. That's the system that you are promoting now.
It's an old conversation in the States. Thank you. It's an old conversation in the States over whether the state ought to have a direct relationship in the care and feeding of their labor pool, or whether they should have an indirect relationship with the care and feeding of the labor pool, that is to privatize its management in the hands of corporations or other employers, or to become, like the Cuban military, for example, in Cuba, the monopoly holder of the right to set the minimum parameters for the utilization of labor within the territory of the country. The parties differ, and the Americans are divided. And frankly, the debate has gotten so operatic that most people have lost track of who means what and what any of this stuff ultimately boils down to.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Just before everyone departs, I have a couple of announcements. Maybe I'll take the mic again. Is it okay for me to continue this for a second?